just briefly to introduce, Andrew was visiting me, visiting our lab like in 2016 or something, right? I guess.
13,
14.
2013.
Oh,
Yeah.
13, really?
Was it 14? 14. It was the first half of 2014. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, he was here only for you were here only for half a year or something, right?
Yeah.
But then did a very nice intracranial recording based phi approximation in published in 2019, 17.
17.
And also together with some of you guys may know that how richness kind of a commentary with Julio and so Christoph that has been also quite successful, and we have been kind of working on and off about various things. And he today talks about recent his focus on the peripheral vision and also richness of the perception. Please go ahead. Walk.
Um, so seeing playing cards in the visual periphery, that's what this is about. Let me close my little window in the corner here. So the idea for this study comes from Daniel Dennett. I read Consciousness Explained when I was in college, and there's a long story as to why I came to it. I don't think I was really interested in consciousness or vision then, but I was after I read it, and it introduced me to a lot of ideas, a lot of things that I hadn't heard of before that I thought were very interesting. And like it's funny because like in the years since, I've come to think that almost everything he had to say about vision was wrong. And I don't agree with much of what he had to say about consciousness, but it did get me started, but this is based on one thing that I think is wrong, or it's not as right as it's often claimed to be, which has to do with what you can see in peripheral vision. And up here, this isn't a quote from the book. There's a few paragraphs in there where he details this. It's kind of like a demonstration / thought experiment. It's something you can do for yourself to see how poor peripheral vision is. The idea is that you take a playing card and you hold it, beyond the limit of the visual field, and you bring it slowly in towards the fovea, and you'll be surprised at how close it has to be to the center of the visual field before you can tell what the color is, what the suit is, and before you can identify the card. And he uses this not only to demonstrate, I think it's fine to use this to demonstrate, like the lower resolution of the periphery, which is a fact. But an important part of this demonstration is the surprise, right? The fact that people seem like they didn't realize that the resolution was so poor out in the periphery. It's as though people think they should have been able to see the card at a much larger eccentricity than they really could. And this gets used as like a classroom demonstration, I think. You bring somebody up in front of the class and have them do this, and they're like, oh, wow, I thought I would be able to see it out here, but it had to be much closer. So there's something to it. But based on, I've done a lot of experiments over the years in peripheral vision and having to do with seeing details and color, and I don't quite buy the idea that people don't know what they can see. I think that people actually do have a pretty fair idea of what visual experience is like. Because then this gets deployed for another rhetorical purpose, which is, if you don't even know what you could see in the periphery, why should we trust your judgments, like your introspective judgments about your experience, right? If you thought that it was all very detailed and colorful way out in the far periphery, but it's actually not, then you really shouldn't believe any of your judgments about your subjective experience. You should be very skeptical about what you think you can see. That's the way this gets used. Okay, but weirdly enough, nobody's ever actually done this as an experiment, as far as I know. I wonder if some people may have actually done this and it didn't work out the way they wanted it to and they didn't complete it. I don't know, but it's kind of surprising that no one's ever actually tried to run this as like a formal study, which is what I've tried to do here. So just straight into the way this thing works. It's a, sort of a vision science psychophysics experiment. The procedure is that a subject comes in. The very first thing to do is to confirm with them that they know what playing cards look like, that they're familiar with sort of standard playing card design, which I think most people are, and everyone that I've tested has been, hasn't had a trouble with it. Everybody knows what aces and spades and kings and tens and sevens are and what they look like. So the next thing is that the person sits down and they look at a screen, and I show them a card. This is all on a computer screen. They see a playing card, they fixate it, and then a Gaussian blob appears at some eccentricity, off in the periphery. And they're asked a question, which is, if this card of this size were presented at the cued eccentricity, would you be able to identify the suit or the rank of the card? So that's done in separate blocks. So first we do suit, and then in later blocks we do the rank of the card. So could you identify the suit of the card if it were presented out here? And they have a multiple choice. There's like a 4-point rating that they can give, and I'll explain that in a minute. The wording of it is important, I think. After they complete this, it takes about 20 minutes. After they do this, they do a visual imagery, sort of standard visual imagery questionnaire, because I thought, this is kind of a visual imagery task. I'm asking them to judge what they think they could see out here. Maybe they're using a visual image to do it. So I may as well do a visual imagery questionnaire. I'm not going to mention this again because the scores in the VVIQ didn't correlate with anything else in the study. So they didn't correlate with the predictions. They didn't correlate with the actual accuracy. So there doesn't seem to be anything to it. Maybe if I dig into it more, I might find something, but it didn't come to anything. So after they do this VVIQ, it's kind of like a short break with pencil and paper. They go back to the computer, and now they're going to actually try to identify these cards at the peripheral positions. So now they're fixating, a spot on the screen, and a card, a card of some size appears at some eccentricity, and now they have to identify what was the rank of the card. So hearts, spades, diamonds, clubs, and it's like you click a box on the screen to identify what it was. Or in later blocks, you have to identify the rank. So was it a 2 or a 7 or a king or a jack? Yeah. And they do that. That takes 20 or 30 minutes. And then when that's finished, I had a short set of questions about like their background, like what's your major, what do you know about visual perception, and what did you think of the task? Was it easier or harder than you thought it would be? That kind of thing. Okay, so now I'll explain some of this in more detail. So first about the stimuli. So I mean, these are, you see some pictures here. They're very like ordinary playing card design. And I think that generally playing cards are nice stimuli for an experiment like this, because everyone's familiar with them. Everyone knows how to sort and categorize them. Everyone knows their names. So I found I think it could be useful in other contexts, actually. It's neat. It's kind of like using letters or numbers or characters as stimuli, but these actually have a couple of dimensions of variation, and they have different colors and textures. So that's nice. So they were presented at different eccentricities and different sizes. And the reason for that is, eccentricity is the thing that I'm kind of interested in. Like what do people think they can see, and what can they see in the periphery? But I also varied the size of the cards kind of as a standard difficulty factor. But the idea is that, maybe we're eluded about what you can see in the periphery. Maybe you overestimate what you can see there. But I don't think anyone would argue that we overestimate what we can see for very small things. Like, I think everyone knows that when things get very small, they get harder to see. And that foveally. So when something's hard to see, you zoom in on it, or you bring it closer to your face, or you walk closer so you can see it better. Like, everybody knows that smaller things are harder to see. So I use that kind of as a non-illusory difficulty factor. This is a schematic to show kind of like the sizes of things in the experiment. So the 4 card sizes you could describe as being very small. And everything was at 1 meter, so it was a little bit further than arm's length. It was just convenient because it's a curved screen, and that way, if I put the screen at 1 meter, then the stimuli are always 1 meter away from the subject. So it's just convenient to use that distance. So there's a very small card size, which the size of the card would be about the size of your fingertip at arm's length. That's what this is illustrating here. So it's very small. So it's almost hard to see foveally, but you can recognize them foveally pretty well. The next size you could say is small, and the next size is about the size of a standard playing card. And then there's a large size, right? So that's the 4 different sizes that I use. And they were at these 4 eccentricities. So I think that's 4 degrees, 8 degrees, 16, and then 24. So those were the eccentricities. So it didn't go far, far out, but past the blind spot, so far enough, I think. Although, I mean, the question of like, does what I'm going to show you, does that hold up like at 60, 70 degrees eccentricity? That's a good question. And I think it's interesting to look at what kind of information is actually available to you just based on your visual acuity at these eccentricities. So, these aren't huge eccentricities, but it's enough to degrade these stimuli. So below we have the normal sized cards. So you can see at 24 degrees eccentricity, you've lost a lot of detail. Crowding makes things even worse. Positional uncertainty and other things is going to make things worse. But this is kind of the best you would be able to do in terms of seeing the spatial detail at 24 degrees. The small size cards up here are interesting because you can see how the color information is lost. Like once you get out to 16 degrees eccentricity, really the redness of the hearts and the diamonds is almost invisible. When you get to 24 degrees, you can't really see much red anymore. But there's still a good amount of detail. So if I use like a perfect ideal observer with this model at the front end, this is just a model of contrast sensitivity and visual acuity across the visual field, you'd do really well. You'd be almost perfect. But there's more sources of noise involved in peripheral vision, so I wouldn't want to simulate it that way. But this is kind of like an upper bound of like what you would be able to see. So the way the first phase of the experiment, like I said, it's the prediction phase. The subject they're fixating here at 0 degrees eccentricity, and the card appears there at fixation, so they can see it clearly. And it's at whatever size it is, so they might see a small card here or a large card here. And then as that card is presented, a Gaussian blob appears at some eccentricity and kind of pulses very slowly to make sure that they can see it. So the reason to use a Gaussian blob is that it's naturally blurred, right? So the cue itself doesn't afford any information about the resolution of the visual field there. Let's see what else. Oh, yeah, and there might be children running in here at some random moment, but it'll be okay. So the question that subjects were asked on each trial was, could you identify if, I had to explain this in advance, so they knew what this meant, but this is what they saw on the screen. Could you identify the suit? So the longer version of the question would be, if this card at this size were presented at the cued location, could you identify the suit? Right? And they had 4 options to respond. They could say definitely yes, maybe no, and definitely no. Okay, so that was their option. So they did 2 blocks of that, and then they did 2 blocks where it was, could you identify the rank of the card, like that it's a 2 or a 7 or a 10 or whatever. So they did this for these 4 eccentricities, and it was all crossed with different card sizes at each of the different eccentricities. Let's see. Yeah, that's the same thing. So they do that. They do the VVIQ, and then the imagery questionnaire. And then we do the identification phase. And I didn't actually tell them in advance that there was going to be this test. I think some of them probably would have guessed that was coming. But they weren't told at any point before we actually started that you're going to do an actual test of identifying the cards at these positions. So they sat down, and now what they have to do is fixate a spot here, or a fixation mark. That's what the 0 degrees eccentricity is. And now a card appears at some eccentricity, a card of some size appears at some eccentricity, and then it disappears. So it's on for 1 second, and then it disappears, and then they have to say, what was the suit of the card? And they have a multiple choice here, or what was the rank of the card? And then there's 13 choices on the screen. Was it an ace or a 2 or a 3 or a 4? So on, they have to click it. And then after they respond, the next trial starts. Do this for a bunch of trials for rank and suit. Yeah, so this is the basic layout of the experiment, right? So predict suit, predict rank, identify suit, identify rank, right? And then I asked them some questions. And this all took about an hour to do. This was a single session experiment. But the individual subject data still looks pretty good, even with such a short experiment. Okay, so how are we going to look at this data? So I'm going to show, I think most of the plots that are going to come are going to be on these axes, where on the x-axis we have the expected accuracy. So that's some kind of an average over the ratings that they gave in the prediction phase. And on the y-axis, we have the actual accuracy. So that's basically just the rate at which they were correct, like their hit rate in the identification phase. So that's the actual accuracy is, like I said, it's very straightforward. It's the hit rate. You could be 100% correct for some condition, or you could be at chance. And here, this is like a combined chance level. So like if it's the suit condition, chance would be 25%. You know, you have 4 suits to guess from. But what's interesting here is that you might think that, well, there's not an obvious mapping between the expected and the actual accuracy, but I think that there is a pretty straightforward prediction to be made here, and that's what this diagonal line is. Because of these 4 options, 2 of them, I think, have a very straightforward translation into hit rate. So if someone says that definitely yes, I would be able to identify this card, what they're saying is that I would be 100% correct, right? I don't think that's a big leap. And then down here at the left, if they say definitely no, I would not be able to identify it, they're saying that they would be at chance. Yeah. And then in between, like what does maybe mean? Well, you know that maybe yes means that they're predicting a higher hit rate than maybe no. But as to where exactly those would be placed, it could go different ways for different people. And I think that the good optimal hands-off prediction is that they would just interpolate. And I think I found some references that would support the idea that with a lack of information, what people will do, they will actually interpolate these kinds of things on a straight line. But yeah. So this is if people are accurate, or if they have good knowledge about what they can see, then their predictions and their actual accuracy should fall on this diagonal line. So now we look at the data. Oh wait, not yet. Subjects. This is kind of interesting. I've tested 18 people. This was all last year. I haven't had any. I want to put more into it. I was aiming for 25. I might try to get more. I haven't had time this year to run any subjects. But I was looking at the demographics for it, and 15 of the 18 subjects are female. This is just random. All of my subjects are volunteers. Like there's an ad on the lab website that people can be directed to from various sources. And so people just want to sign up for a study. So they're not coming in like for a credit from a class, which I think would probably give a more balanced like gender distribution. But for this, for whatever reason, the people that I assigned into this study were almost all women. I don't think that means anything, but it's interesting that it's so imbalanced. And they're all student age to like late graduate student age, I would say, or postdoc age. But none of these, I will say that in advance, none of these subjects were like from our lab. None of them were the closest thing. We had a couple of like social science graduate students, but there were no perception students, no one who had really studied this kind of stuff in the past. Yeah, so here's this guy. So here's a first look at the data. So here it's just averaging over everything. So averaging over eccentricity, averaging over card type for each subject. So each of these dots is one subject. And so you see that most of them actually do fall on this main diagonal. So they are actually mostly pretty good predictors of their performance. You could say that, maybe some of them are clearly just overestimating. Like these subjects over here, their average rating was close to 3, which means that most of the time they were saying definitely yes, whatever the condition. But most people, hold on a second. That was
okay.
All right. Yeah, so some of these, I think most of the subjects, they are falling on this main diagonal. So on average, people are pretty accurate about their performance. People seem to have pretty good general kind of expectations of what they can see. Some people are really underestimating what they can see. They're much more likely to say, on average, that they don't think they'll be able to recognize a target, even though their hit rates are pretty far above chance. Closer to perfect performance than chance. But who knows? Like I said, this might have a lot to do with how you interpret those maybes. So people might have something other than a linear interpolation going on here. But look at the correlation here is, I think, pretty good. And really, you can just interpret that as it means that different subjects do have a different ability to do the task, and they know. So someone who's going to be bad at it kind of knows that they're going to be bad at it. Someone who's going to be good at it knows that they're going to be good at it. So people seem to know a decent amount about what they can see. All right, next one. So now we can start to break it out into some more detail. So here I've got like the predicted accuracy, just the average expected accuracy as a function of the card rank. You can see it kind of varies a bit. People expect to be good at aces and bad at 8s and 9s. And then when you look at the actual accuracy, this is averaging over all subjects. People are best at aces and they're worst at 8s and 9s. And actually, card by card, they're actually pretty well ordered by their rank. So at a level of individual cards, this is harder to show for individual data because there's not enough samples of different cards within a subject. But even within subjects, the correlation on average is positive. But this means that people know, like, this specific card will actually be easier or harder to see off in the periphery at various sizes. So people seem to know a lot. All right, but now we get to the main thing that I'm interested in, which is seeing across the visual field, how much does eccentricity have to do with this? So it could be that you get these other effects of, like, average accuracy or expected or average accuracy for individual card types, but eccentricity might not be a factor, right? So it might be that people are totally, like, leaving out and ignoring the fact that things are going to be harder in the periphery. That's still possible. So now we can look at this and look at how the expected accuracies go as a function of card size. So towards the top, cards are getting smaller, and towards the right, cards are getting more eccentric. So down here in the lower left-hand corner, I don't think I mentioned, but there's one. So I didn't include so for the smallest eccentricity, I didn't present the largest card size because it would overlap with the fovea. So that's not actually included in any of these. Subjects didn't see that condition. But for the next best thing, which is large cards that are presented at relatively small eccentricities, people had a pretty high expectation they would be able to recognize it. They gave lots of definitely yeses here, lots of definitely yeses, and very few definitely nos. Okay, but then you go the opposite side, which is the very small card presented at the largest eccentricity, and people are mostly responding no. They're mostly saying, no, I don't think I'll be able to recognize it. And the most likely response is, I definitely won't be able to recognize it. Okay, so people have some and you can see this as a function of eccentricity in each row. As you go from left to right, you're going from saying mostly yes to saying mostly no. Right? But if the cards are larger, then it tempers that. Yeah. So this is already telling you that people have some idea of how this is going to go. This is the data for the rank or the suit condition. This is for rank, so it's pretty similar. There's not a meaningful difference between the rank and the suit conditions. And then this is the actual accuracy. Right? So these are confusion matrices for, I think on the y-axis is the presented suit over here. The presented card on the x-axis is the guess. And so again, this is averaged over all subjects. So you see, when the cards are large or close to fixation, the responses are almost all in the main diagonal, right? So people are very accurate about big cards or medium-sized cards that are close to the fovea. But when things get smaller or more peripheral, or especially if they get smaller and more peripheral, people make a lot more mistakes, right? But I would point out that even though people are making a lot more mistakes out there in the periphery, there's still a lot of structure to the confusion matrix. So the kinds of errors that people make are for nearby cards, right? So they didn't get that it was a 7, but they thought it was a 5. But nobody mistakes a 7 for a king, or nobody thinks that an ace is actually a 5, right? Even at the largest eccentricities. So people don't really make those kinds of mistakes. So they still see something. Okay, so now we do some stuff averaging over these. What is this? This is this critical size analysis. Kind of breaks the flow a little bit, but still. So what this is doing is at each eccentricity, as you go from large size to small size, or as you go from small size to large size, your performance is going to get better, right? And so you can fit a psychrometric function to that and pick off a threshold, like what's your, at what card size are you 80% correct? I think actually I was more methodical about it. And then say, okay, what's the critical card size at each eccentricity, right? And that's what we did here for suit and rank. And so you can see that it grows basically linear with eccentricity, which this is the pattern you see for one thing, for acuity. As you move out into the periphery, your acuity increases linearly with eccentricity. It's the same thing for crowding zones, right? So as you move out into the periphery, the size of the crowding zone increases linearly with eccentricity. So this is following the right kind of pattern. So people's accuracy in the task it has the right kind of structure for me to believe that they're doing the right kind of thing. But also even though people are, I was actually kind of surprised at how good people were at the task. But when you compare this with letter acuity as a function of eccentricity, people can identify much, much smaller targets. Even at 24 degrees eccentricity, you can identify, you make lots of errors, but you can still, above threshold, identify a letter that's like a fraction of a degree across at 20-something degrees eccentricity. So this is reasonable performance. Can also use this as kind of a response to the fact that I did have an eye tracker running during the experiment, so I was monitoring people to make sure they were fixating. Once in a while, I would have to warn a subject that you're looking around, stop looking around. But I don't think that looking around really contributed to the results, because this is what you would expect if people were doing the task peripherally. So that's kind of a reality check. All right. Now back to the size eccentricity bit. So these black and red lines here, this is the data averaged. So I've got those matrices you were seeing before, where I could vary size, or I could vary eccentricity. And so within those matrices, then you can average the data in different directions, right? So I can average across size, and then see how does expected and actual accuracy vary as eccentricity is increased. So as you go this way, for the red line, for the red symbols, people are getting worse at the task. That's why it's going down, and it's because things are getting more eccentric, right? And they also expected to get worse at it. And you also see that this is falling pretty close to that main diagonal. Same thing for size. That for size, as you make things smaller, people expected to get worse. That's why the markers are going leftward, and people actually did get worse. That's why the markers are going down. But you see that for the size one, it's exactly on the main diagonal, right? So their predictions having to do with size were perfect. Exactly what you would predict with this minimal rule that I described earlier. But for eccentricity, there is kind of this curvature here. So there's kind of some underestimation here, and then some overestimation of difficulty up here, and then some underestimation down here. So there's kind of it's a bit steeper, right? So you might think that this means that people are discounting the difficulty associated with eccentricity, that as things get more eccentric, they're moving leftward at the same rate, but their actual accuracy is dropping faster, right? So maybe that's this demo effect. that people are talking about. That means that people actually are underestimating how hard it is to see in the periphery, just a little bit. So I saw this, I was like, okay, so Dennett was kind of correct. All right, a little tiny bit. But then, once I collected, this is how I was looking at the data at first. I was looking at the average. A new subject came in, I would add it to the average and just looking at it. Once I had a few subjects, I started looking at the individuals. And this is what I saw. And it's a bit noisier, but what you see looking from one subject to the next is that for some of them, this relation between expected and actual accuracy is exactly the same for the size factor and for the eccentricity factor. So they're not treating, like these two subjects here, are not treating size and eccentricity differently at all. So as something becomes more eccentric, they think it's going to become more difficult, and it's actually more difficult to the same degree that making it smaller made them expect it to be more difficult, and that it actually was more difficult. Yeah. But then some subjects are not doing that, right? So some subjects, and all these numbers on here are from a fitting procedure to try to determine, are these data better explained by one function, like one mapping between predicted and actual accuracy, or are they better explained by two functions? Is it like people are using two different rules? So the subjects that are outlined with the blue boxes, those are subjects where it seems like they're using two different rules. They have a size rule, and they have a size mapping, and they have an eccentricity mapping. And for every one of these subjects that are using the different mappings, they all go the same way, except for this person, which I think is kind of marginal, which is that they have a much steeper function for the eccentricity factor, which is in red, than for the size factor, right? So for these subjects, making the target, the cards more eccentric, they progressively underestimated how much harder it would be to actually identify it. But just for these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 subjects. The other 11, there's no statistical reason to think that they were doing such a thing. And if you separate those two groups out and look at the averages for the two groups, it looks like this, right? So these are the subjects who are using a single rule. And so then, of course, there's no difference to them if you ask them, how much harder will it make it to identify the card if it's smaller? Or if I put it way out here in the periphery, then they're going to treat those two questions the same way, right? So they don't, and they're going to do it basically optimally. They're doing it correctly. There's no sign here of over or underestimating things on average. Like individual subjects, like I showed you earlier, some people are above the line, some are below it. But a lot of people are right on it. Whereas these biased subjects, the average bias is like this, where people are, I think the main way to look at this is the fact that the red line is steeper, right? That it drops off faster. That as things become more eccentric, then things get harder faster than you thought they would. So these are the sort of ideal Dennett prediction subjects. Okay, so I'm getting towards the end here, and then I just have some random material to mention. So one thing is, I think this is my conclusion so far, is that individual subjects do know something about what they can see in the periphery. This knowledge is pretty detailed. This thing that I showed earlier about how like the predicted accuracy actually orders the actual accuracy for individual card types. That holds true for just the eccentric. If I filter it out just for the more eccentric positions, that ordering is still there. So people know what they can see down to the level of seeing of like, will I be able to see a 7 or a jack at 20 degrees eccentricity? Like, people have that kind of knowledge about what they can see. And I don't think it's true that people systematically underestimate the difficulty of seeing in the periphery. Okay, but then there's one last thing, which is, like you see, I asked these questions at the end of the task. So it was like, have you ever taken a class in perception? What was your major? That kind of thing. But one of the questions, the last question actually was, having now done the identification task, would you say that it was more or less difficult than you expected it to be based on the prediction task? Yeah, and this is how I put it. So what did you think of the identification task? Was it easier or harder than you expected, or was it about what you expected? And every subject except for one said that it was much harder, and some of them were like emphatic about it, like, oh wow, it was way harder than I thought it was going to be. And only one person, she said, that is about what I thought of. And she was one of the accurate ones, so she was non-biased. So what's going on here? Does this conflict with the main result? That people thought, when I asked them when I did this like kind of molecular trial-wise test of what people thought they could see and what they actually could see, it turns out that people had pretty good knowledge of what they could see. But then when I asked them this big global question about what they had just done, they gave me a totally different answer. They thought that they had way overestimated their performance. They thought that it was a lot harder than they expected it to be. So I don't know what this is about. I don't have an answer for this part yet. My speculation is that what they've just done is a very difficult task. So the identification task is hard. On a lot of trials, you're close to guessing. You do make a lot of mistakes. And this is the last thing they did. And if I asked them, well, what was it like? They may not have actually expected what it would be like to do the difficult task. Like they knew what they could see, but they didn't actually know what it would be like to go through that kind of difficulty. And so they're kind of giving an emotional response rather than a thoughtful one. And maybe that's what's going on in the classroom demonstration. If you could ask people, what do you think you can see? They'll give you a better answer than, what was it like doing this demonstration just now? But I'm not sure. I'll go through these slides, but I bet people will ask questions about these things, so maybe I'll preempt some of them. Eye movements, I already mentioned about. I did have eye tracker running, but I didn't record it. I didn't record the fixation data. I don't, like I showed with the critical size analysis, I don't think there's reason to think that the data are very polluted by random peripheral fixations. But someone could put that argument out there. Crowding is a big thing here. So what makes this experiment different from like the informal experiment is that when you do it informally, you're doing it in a room and there's a background and maybe people standing in the background or there's furniture around you. And in that case, it is going to be a lot harder to identify things because of crowding. And so then it's an open question. If we did this task, if we did this experiment so that in the estimation phase, I had like a crowded background and the Gaussian blob appeared on a crowded background, would people take that into account? I think they probably would, because it would be harder to see the cue, and that should tip them off that it's going to be harder to see out there. So people that should push their expectations down, but would that be sufficient to match the actual accuracy later? Because they're going to be a lot worse at it. Crowding is going to make it a lot harder. But also crowding is already, crowding I think already accounts for a lot of the performance here. And this is a thought, it's like maybe the crowding scenario is closer to the original intentions of the experiment, but I don't think it is. I think that the argument, the way he set it up and the way people use it really is about what kind of details can you see. And sometimes it's so specific, it's about the fact that you don't see colors. So I think this shows you can see those details. You can see the colors. I think it would be interesting to do this in kind of a more crowded context and see how well it holds up, but it's harder than it sounds, I think. Last thing is, what does this have to do with metacognition? I don't think that this is actually a metacognition task. I think it's more actually more like an imagery rating task, even though it didn't correlate with the VVIQ, but I'm not really a metacognition person, so I could be wrong, but I don't think it quite fits. But I think I'll stop now. It's been longer than I promised that it would be. So sorry about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Oh, great, excellent talk.
Okay. Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I will ask question that is absolutely fine with YouTube. The one question I have is, are you presenting the cards on multiple different locations on the screen for a given eccentricity, or for each eccentricity you have one location?
It's just one position. Yeah. So there's like these, they're all on the horizontal midline. Yeah.
I see. Oh, Yeah, so the immediate kind of criticism I can imagine is that, oh, people expect, the location to be there all the time and they have like attention directly directed there. But I imagine this would be a very interesting task to be done on a immersive display that we have in collaboration with an institute in Japan. So that immersive display covers 180 degrees of your visual field. So you can present it in much further, and then also any location given a single periphery. Eccentricity.
Yeah, I'd love to have something like that. I mean, this display, I didn't actually use this whole display. I used half of it.
I see.
It's like a 1.2 meters wide curved display. So I could have had people fixate at one far end of the screen and then been able to go a lot further out. But there were reasons I didn't do that, having to do with like having to move furniture around, and also the fact that pretty soon, like even those like the mid-sized cards would just become invisible. And so like at the large eccentricities, I would need a much larger card that couldn't even fit on the screen to get reasonable performance, So it seemed kind of, what's the point? But yeah, to be able to do it just at random locations, like large eccentricities above and below, right and left, would be amazing. This kind of thing, like looking through a tiny window.
I see. Yeah. And another thing is, you mentioned that before they start the identification tasks, that you ask them to estimate how well they perform at each location. And then afterwards, you give them a questionnaire about how they performed in the identification task. And then they felt the task was very difficult, so they were saying that I performed very badly. But at the same time, you didn't give them feedback on their response, right? I imagine if you give them immediate feedback on, whether their response was correct, and maybe they're at the end of the experiment, their evaluation about their own performance would change.
It might. Yeah, I almost never give feedback, like correct, incorrect feedback. And I'm just in the habit of not doing that, but I don't know if it would hurt in this case. I mean, if you look at the confusion matrices, like for the small card and large eccentricity, people are usually wrong, so maybe it would discourage them because they're usually responding incorrectly, but they're still close. So the fact that they were close, they wouldn't get feedback for that they identified it as a 4 when it was a 5.
I see.
Which seems kind of unfair. So maybe I wouldn't want to do it in this case.
I see.
To tell people, because if you're going to tell people that they were right, you should also maybe tell them that they were close, and then it gets too complicated.
Okay, I see.
But yeah, if I could give them feedback, then that might change their judgment overall at the end, like the right kind of feedback. Yeah, then asking that big overarching question at the end, maybe they would be kind of more metacognitively accurate about what they had just done.
Yep.
Yeah,
okay.
But I'm still not quite sure what to think of that.
That's good. Okay, let's move on. Aniko?
Yes, thank you, Andrew. Very interesting talk. So yeah, I also have 2 questions. The first one is about, do you know what kind of cues people used? Have you kind of explored this in the questions afterwards, whether people were more likely to use like the number of different symbols on the cards for like later peripheries, and then in the fovea maybe they were looking at the actual number. Yeah, have you kind of digged into that?
I've thought about it, but I don't have any way to. The way I would do it would be with like a classification image task, like add noise and see if right, to kind of get back a template of like what features people are using at some position and do it at different positions. But that would be a whole other experiment. I think it would be a neat thing to do. I don't know. Like peripheral vision is really understudied. It's not appreciated, and especially studies of how things vary with eccentricity. It's usually maybe you have a peripheral condition and a foveal condition, And if you're varying things continuously, you're measuring something very simple. But doing something like a classification image at varying eccentricity, I bet it's been done, but probably in a very different kind of context. Maybe it hasn't been done. Yeah, but I would be interested to see, do people shift from using one kind of feature foveally as you go out in the periphery, they shift to less useful, but maybe less crowdable features. That's an interesting.
Maybe based on your confusion matrix, if you can actually show the confusion matrix, we could probably see some kind of trends like that. And so you can probably also analyze to some extent whether, for example, the classification accuracy between the numbers versus the picture card, JQ, is basically exactly the same across size and eccentricity, which is likely to be the case here, right?
You can see this block up here, this little square block up here. That's the face cards, so they get confused with each other. Yeah.
And also is was like perfect, even this one. That's really surprising to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then my intuition is that because for me, like it's a bit strange that like because 8, 9, and 10, like with 8 and 9, I can see that they are kind of similar numbers, but then 10 is quite a different visual. I don't know. Visually, I would say it's quite different. So then I would guess that people were using the icons, and that's more crowded for those.
Yeah, people are. I mean, especially once it's getting small and peripheral, people are seeing rows more than they're seeing individual things. And maybe it's like if it really feels like 2 stripes, then I'm going to say it's a 6. You know, if it feels more muddled together, I'd say it's a 10. But yeah, I want to do more because I like to do these things. I just haven't had time for it. But like I said, I have this acuity model that I can put at the front end, and then see what kind of noise do I need to add to it to get these kinds of confusion matrices. If I really want to model the performance in detail, what kind of noise do I need? And that would kind of be getting at your question. So yeah, maybe you could get something like that out. I don't know. I'll try.
Okay, and just quickly, my second question. I don't want to take up so much time from others. So I am definitely very stricken by these individual differences, and that there are like so many people who are using different strategies, and it's like it's a significant portion of the sample who is like, oh, okay, actually they are quite different, but then all of this difference gets kind of averaged out, which is, I think it's quite a big issue when we are trying to describe humans and in general humans, and when there's actually more like diversity in how people experience things. So yeah, I think this is like super interesting, and to me it's quite like it makes sense that not everyone experiences things and able to judge things the same way. But I was wondering, do you have kind of like a guess or an estimation, like just based on the variance in the strategies and the performance, how many people, like ideally, how many people should we include in these studies to actually explore this kind of perceptual diversity, or at least within the periphery? And I don't know if there are actual physiological or psychophysics tests about these kind of things, but yeah, it's very interesting.
I don't know. I mean, to me, if I could do things more my way and I had more, I mean, I did this my way, but if I could change something about it or get more out of it, it would be to have it longer and have the subjects come back for multiple visits and get more data out of them, because then you could see a lot more about how, because these kinds of differences here might just be within the variance of the study itself, right? So these people might actually be a lot more similar, but the fact that I was only collecting a few hundred trials each meant that some of them just, had a, worse luck with it than others. And they come out on one side of the plot versus the other. So I don't know how much of this variance is actually differences in the way people are perceiving the thing versus the fact that it's kind of a small number of trials per subject. So if I wanted to know how different people really are, first thing would be I want more trials per subject. And then I think just like the things that you see later on, which I trust more, like these might be real differences between people. And based on this, you just need a handful of people to find some kind of difference, you know. Like within the first 4 subjects, I had 2 of one type and 2 of the other type. Yeah, I would be thinking more about trials.
Okay, we should go to next, but just a quick follow-up. I think, you know, because your starting question was Dennett, right? I think it would be very nice to study also the old people. I mean, even at the time he was already old, right? You know, 50 or 60, right? And the
Yep.
peripheral vision, looking at my parents, may be affected very severely. And also another thing is that the glass, Dennett had probably a pretty thick glass, you know, because he was reading a lot. And the far periphery is not covered by the glass. So the looking at super far periphery without glass and also very older people may also exacerbate some kind of individual difference, and maybe for his phenomenology, it might happen that, you know, he may not be really seeing the color in the crowded natural vision.
I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, my mind goes to like eye diseases and stuff because my wife's an optometrist and I spent a lot of time in like a clinical vision lab, you know. So yeah, people with like glaucoma, the classic thing is that they don't realize how much sensitivity they've lost until it's revealed to them by the eye doctor, you know, that they've actually lost a lot, but they don't realize that anything is wrong. So you might expect that they would give like normal predictions in a task like this, but then it turns out that they really are like vastly overestimating what they can see in the periphery, and it's because of the disease. Like old people who don't have glaucoma, I don't know. I would be charitable and think that this same thing should really apply to young or old, you know. But yeah, once you've got like bifocals or something on, or those sorts of stuff, we're going to come in there and mix it up. But it would be interesting to show a big effect, like in some kind of disease population. Yeah.
Okay. Let's move on. Trin.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the talk. Thank you for a good talk. And I have a question regarding well, you mentioned potential criticism, and you said participants' eye movement or eye movement was monitored in some way, and they might receive a warning, right? Can you explain more on that?
Basically, I'm sitting when subjects are doing experiments. I'm sitting on the other side of a partition,
okay,
and watching the eye tracker. So in some of the experiments that I'm running, we actually do record the data. But for this thing, I think because I had written it quickly and I didn't figure out in time how to properly integrate the eye link with the PsychoPy, which that was the first time I tried to do it, and I failed, and I wanted to start collecting data. So yeah, I'm just sitting there watching before I do the experiment, I calibrate the eye tracker, you know, so like I see them fixating, but I didn't do much recalibration and stuff like that. And
I see.
But I'm actually watching the eye, and I have the fixation marker. If you're familiar with the eye link software, there's a fixation marker on the screen, and I'm just sitting there watching it while they
Okay. Yeah, and then a potential solution might be transferring the task from a very large screen to something like a virtual reality glasses that people can wear, and that can easily integrate an eye tracking data. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So I think
Okay.
technically this could all be done much better. I think with better skills
Yeah,
and
okay.
better equipment, then you could do a much better job. I don't doubt it. Yeah.
Anyway, that's already a very good task. And I have another maybe a quick question. And although you said you are not a metacognition person, to me it seems like the task is exploring people's knowledge about themselves. And I wonder what's your initial motivation? I mean, your motivation of this such kind of task in the first place?
Well, yeah, the motivation is the idea that people, what do people think they can see, and how well does that match up with what they can actually see? If you can separate those things. Because you might think that, well, what you believe about what you can see is just constantly being driven by what you're actually seeing, but that's not necessarily true, because you're usually, focused on the fovea. You're not usually paying attention to what's happening in the periphery. So and if something interesting happens in the periphery, you swing your foveas over to it. So you don't usually, most people I think don't really spend a lot of time thinking about what they can see in the periphery. So the question is, do they nevertheless know something about it? Or can they figure it out quickly, in this circumstance? And because I think that does get at the problem that is posed by Dennett and these others, which is that people seem to think they can see lots of colorful, detailed stuff out there, but it turns out that they can't, and they didn't realize that they couldn't. That shows a big disconnect between what people believe about our experiences and what's actually true about our experiences. I don't think that disconnect is really real. I'm sure there's some disconnects here and there having to do with little things, but I think people actually have pretty good knowledge of what your experience is, more or less like what you think it is. That's what I want to demonstrate, or find out.
Thank you.
If it is true.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. But to be frankly, it sounds still very close to metacognitive studies. Okay.
Yeah, but because it's kind of similar to the types of judgments that people do in metacognition study, or like if you just have people do a confidence rating. Someone does a yes, no, or a first, second choice in a psychophysics experiment, and then you do a confidence rating. What they're doing is they're judging the perceptual judgment that they just made. That's what makes it a metacognition. You're making a judgment about something about your judgment. Whereas in this case, I'm not sure how people are doing it. It could be that some people are actually kind of doing it in a thoughtful, intellectual way. Like, what do I know about what I can see out there? And they're making a judgment about what they think is true about there. And in that case, it is kind of cognitive, and maybe it's connected to making judgments about your perception. But I think some people probably are actually doing it as an imagery task. I didn't tell them to do it that way, but it's like, imagine that this card were out here. Would you be able to see the details of the card? And some people, to do that task, they're gonna actually try to conjure up a visual image, a mental image there, and make a judgment about it. And I don't think anybody would say that making judgments about mental images is metacognition, or maybe somebody would. But
yeah, I see the key difference. Thank you. I see the key difference. Yeah.
But I'm not sure about it. But I'm not really sure.
I mean, probably what Trin also implied was we could actually compute the type 2 AUC kind of, so-called metacognitive accuracy or metacognitive sensitivity. We don't know whether this is a form of metacognition or not, but you can analyze the data in the way to quantify how much people know about their actual performance, or how much they are able to predict their performance. And that's a form of kind of metacognition, I think.
And also, sorry, I'll be very quick. And also the way you ask questions, like definitely no, maybe yes, definitely yes. It's very similar to how our lab measures decision and confidence. So what we do is we develop this response screen that ranges from -4 to 4, and plus minus correspond to yes, no, and then 1 to 4 correspond to level of confidence. So one click would allow you to report both confidence and decision at the same time. So that's actually very similar to what we do. I guess that's why Chuyin asked the question.
Yeah, it has a lot in common, at least at the level of how the task works, and the way it's presented to the subject. It has a lot in common. But in terms of what they're doing, how they are actually making the decision, I'm not sure if it's the same kind of mental process going on.
Okay.
It's got to be kind of different, because they're so separated in time. They must be fairly different.
Right. Okay. Then let's move on. Daisuke.
Hi. Thanks for your talk. It was pretty nice. I have two questions slash suggestions maybe. One is capping on the Kenshin's comments, like the metacognitive test kind of style. The reason asking for this is a bit different because you at some point mentioned the overestimation, underestimation, if the subject is above the diagonal line or below the diagonal line. And I'm not super comfortable with it because X and Y axis are, kind of different kind of metric you're asking. And so what, potentially, you can mitigate this problem is that you ask the same question to the X and Y axis. What I mean by that is right after you present the cards in the actual task, you also ask how confident you are. That's where you can compare directly between the two axes.
Yeah, I did consider, like in the accuracy task, in the second task, putting a confidence judgment on it, or doing something like what you guys do, like having the multi-level choice, like having rows of pick the top row, pick the suit out of the top row if you're very confident, pick the suit out of the bottom row if you're not confident. But it felt like it was already pretty complicated with the maybe I could have done it, but you're right.
Maybe just a subset of your task.
Yeah, because then you could actually test, because it might turn out that they're different, that maybe the predictions follow a different pattern from the metacognition, but they might turn out to follow a similar pattern, because I think typically, like with the metacognitive accuracy, you're more accurate about conditions that you're more first order accurate, right? Which is kind of the same way the predictions went here. So they could be very similar in their structure, even if they're still different things, I don't know. I think, like I said, I want to run a lot more subjects in this. I can still add some features, try to do it in a different way.
My second question is actually a kind of suggestion is that your subject so far is, so-called weird, people, right? Western educated. And so I'm very curious to know, other demographics. Especially I'm curious, what children, for instance. My experience is that children are typically overconfident. And so you might find, people like in the in your second group of people. It's just a comment.
Yeah, I mean, if this is really a test of, if the prediction thing is really a test of knowledge, you would think that's something that takes time to acquire, so it might be that, children don't really have any good understanding of the fact that, things are harder to see out there because they just go and look. And it takes a certain amount of discipline, which is, again, something you have to practice to be able to sit and fixate something while something is happening out here and not look at it, so again, that's a matter of practice and learning. So
right.
About that, we recently have two publications from Ryoichi Watanabe and also Yusuke Moriguchi, their lab. We used confidence rating or similarity rating with confidence, and I know that there has been some kind of literature saying that, but we don't see much evidence that children are overconfident. Maybe this is again similar to sort of meta kind of cognitive bias, like we should not be able to see the periphery, or children should not be able to rate the confidence or something. But when you ask it, they may be actually quite accurate, actually. Anyway, just be brief. Let's move on. Anson, and then Zoe next.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew, for the very interesting talk, and specifically like the discussion about metacognition and going back to like what we know about what we see. And there are comments that I had at the start that Daisuke and Chun has already asked, but that inspires also another question. So from the answers that you gave to Chun, it seems like you're already aware of the sort of the type of retrospective self-confidence rating. And I'm just wondering what motivates you to do the sort of prospective estimate as opposed to a retrospective estimate for the participants. Yeah.
It's because if we were doing this in the more typical kind of like trial structure where I show you a stimulus and then you make a judgment about it and then I ask you like the confidence rating or something like that, then what I'm doing is the subject is getting a lot of practice with the stimulus, so you understand what I'm saying, right? That really quickly they're going to learn how hard it is to see things out there, and then pretty quickly they're going to adjust their expectations about the
I see.
That's the reason why first I ask what they think they can see, and it's a blank screen and a Gaussian cube. So I'm trying not to actually give them any information about what the resolution is like out there. So you could kind of think about like, what do you know about your acuity or like the spatial resolution of your visual field out here? I'm not going to give you any information about it, but what do you know about it? And then I test. That's really the way I've thought about this.
Okay. So to sort of avoid this type of like I don't know if there's even a word for it, but like your idea of like, just because I think it is bad or I think it's difficult, therefore I'm going to perform it worse, and then therefore I think it's going to be more difficult. This type of cycle that you're mentioning. Would it be possible if you just ask at the end, like just show them each condition again, just like at the start, but then ask for their individual rating for each of the eccentricity times size combination? Would that sort of mitigate the problem? And then you can still investigate like how does the expectations and like how do they think that they performed, if that makes sense, in each of the conditions, so that you have more analysis to play with.
That's good. I like that because then I could do that quickly, right? So like as like a postscript to the whole experiment, what you add on is one last thing. It's going to be short, but yeah, you show a few exemplars for each. It doesn't have to be many, many, many trials. It's like a magnitude rating. You just have them give a rating, like how well do you think you did at this condition? Having done
exactly.
And to see if they learned something, because I think that I would think that it shouldn't be that different, right, on average, because it seems like in advance they already knew, so afterwards it shouldn't change much. But I wonder if maybe some people would have changed, if that would pick out a different group.
Yeah, like the dynamics of the changing of the metacognition and how they do it, like as they sort of imagine doing the task versus after actually doing the task, and have a different metacognitive perception of it. I don't know. It's just interesting. Like just something that came into my mind. Yeah, but it was interesting.
I like that idea. Let me think about that. I like that.
Thank you.
Okay, Zoe.
Yeah, that was a very interesting talk. I wanted to ask, given that the measures that you're getting from the participants for the identification task is an accuracy measure, like they're supposed to identify what the rank is and what the suit is, do you think that like the mismatch between them saying after the experiment that it was much harder than they thought, whereas they were performing pretty well, reminded me kind of like a blind sight situation. So I'm wondering if you thought about the possibility of like some kind of an unconscious processing going on, especially for the identification of the rank.
I hadn't thought of that, but I did something else you just said. It had occurred to me that, maybe this wasn't quite when I'm asking them, would you be able to identify this thing? The identification task maybe isn't exactly what they had in mind, like for one thing, it's multiple choice. Maybe what they would have thought was, I just get to call out the name of the card that I think I would see, and that maybe they would be better or worse in that context. You'd think it would be the same, but maybe not necessarily. Another thing is that it was timed. So whereas in the prediction phase, the cards stayed on until they responded. And on average, they responded within like a couple of seconds, but it didn't disappear because I wanted to make sure that they saw it while they judged if they would be able to see it in the periphery. But in the identification phase, the card came on and it disappeared in 1 second. You know, so in a way, that was there was no way that they weren't expecting that. You know, so I think that there's something to that. That might also drive some of the response at the end. That not only was the task hard, but there are ways in which it was harder. But like in a task related way, it was harder than they would have expected. You know what I'm saying?
So in the identification task, there might have been a little more guessing going on because of the timing.
Yeah, or there's more pressure. You know, it's more stressful. They didn't have all that. Like in the prediction phase, the stimulus stayed on the screen until they responded. So they can kind of set their own pace. In the identification phase, it comes on and it goes off, and now they have to respond. And so now they're kind of more locked into it. And they might be using kind of different processes to identify the targets in that case. Then, even though I didn't tell them you're going to do this task later and it's going to have some characteristic, but in some way they might have, I don't know quite how to put it, but it's different than what they would have expected based on the prediction task. I think there might be something to that. As to like blind sight or that there's something unconscious going on, I don't know. I mean, I think we're all to some degree unconscious of some of the processes that underlie, you know, perception and recognition of things. Like you don't know quite how you're doing it. You just know, oh, that was a king, you know, and you can't quite say why you knew it. But
right. Yeah, I guess related to that, like what if you're asking people to judge like the spatial resolution of what they expect to see in the periphery during the expectation or prediction task, that seems to me more like the experience of seeing something, whereas the identification task is more, it seems to me more like a performance. So there might be a mismatch there.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's and I think that explains the surprise at the end. So, which I think still is I like that better than that the surprise at the end is because, you know, they really didn't know what they would be able to see, and that their predictions were somehow just conveniently in line with the actual performance. I think they actually knew something, but the added factor was that this was actually a hard task, and it involved some things that they weren't expecting.
Thank you.
Okay. Your point was actually quite good. I like it because Andrew's initial motivation was whether this is actually even possible or not, right? I mean, the Dennett type people believe that it shouldn't be possible, so you didn't think about this. But I think this question of whether this peripheral card suit is consciously phenomenally experienced or not is the next step. And to do that, one way we have been usually using is this post-decision confidence rating and then quantify a type 2 accuracy, because blindsided patients cannot actually do this. So above chance, type 2 accuracy on each trial by trial basis will be able to, give the evidence that this is not unconscious. That's what we use for the unattended stimulus in the periphery. And the second thing, it would be, more exciting for us right now is a qualia structure type approach to see whether the similarity structure in the periphery, is it the same at the fovea like Ariel did? And then if that structure is similar in the periphery and small thing, then that's quite, convincing, I think. So
I mean, the same kind of things you're doing with color, you could do with, you can do with, I mean, there's not enough, letters aren't interesting enough, even cards aren't enough, but like with characters, like Chinese characters, right? So, which are very complex, but they're very recognizable.
Right.
They have a lot of detail, a lot of spatial detail. And so how do they get confused with one another in the periphery? What kinds of mistakes do people make, and what parts of them do you think they're using to make the mistakes?
Right.
And you could, and it'll probably be, people will be a lot better at it than you expect. And even though they're making mistakes, it still supports the idea that you're seeing a lot of spatial structure there. There's a lot of ordered spatial structure, but it's limited by things like crowding and acuity.
Yeah, and that Chinese character is actually quite interesting because we can also look at the cultural effects or learning effect to see that, your third level of the recognition is specifically, possible within the, Chinese or Japanese, Korean population, but not at the, US population who have never, learned this kind of Chinese character. But then the similarity structure will reflect the sort of the spatial, feature level thing, right? So that lots of interesting thing, very close to what we are doing in Korea structure. So, okay, Mike.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you for the talk. I'm really interested in this mismatch between the expectations. On one hand, we have participants who are accurate in their predictions on how much they can see in their peripheries. But on the other hand, we have participants almost universally reporting that it is harder than they expected. And I was wondering whether there is some way to reconcile the differences. I was thinking perhaps the participant can go on a single practice trial where they have a standard size card slightly in the eccentricities, and they can establish some kind of baseline difficulties so that later on they can compare, or rather predict, how difficult the other task would be comparing to this baseline.
Maybe, like, you mean at the first phase, like, of having them predict things. I mean, in a sense, they are being given their baseline difficulty is the foveal difficulty. They have the card there, like, in front of them, so they can see what kind of features it has, like what they would have to work with. But I think that letting them have put it at some eccentricity to show them like what you're dealing with, I feel like already that might be giving away too much, or at least I don't think it would be, because I think they already know it. But then someone else could say, like, well, you tipped them off by showing them a card just as a demo, to like get them into it. And right away they knew, oh, things are much fuzzier and blurrier out there than I thought. And so then I should adjust my expectations accordingly. So I would want to avoid it there. But like, yeah, somehow like calibrating people to each other. I haven't thought about how, if there's a bet, like, because really to sit down, I show them, I set it to the first trial. I don't let them practice. There's a card on the screen, and then I ask them this question, and then they just have to answer the same question over and over again. There's a lot of room for people to interpret things a little differently, especially those maybe questions. And if there were a way to get them to place them more regularly, I would go for it. But I don't have any ideas.
Sorry, I asked this largely just because when I think about Dennett's original argument, it's kind of strange, right? Because it seems like many people are convinced by this line of argument, despite the lack of formal evidence. And it seems to me that it's possibly the result of this mismatch where you are finding here, where people casually tried it, and it is universally harder than they expect. And then they come back and they say, well, maybe Dennett is correct, even though it's not exactly supported. So was my point, yes.
Yeah, well, because I think people don't walk around with like well-formed knowledge of like what peripheral vision is like. I mean, people don't have like ready expectations, and so then if you like, take this card and put it out here, and like, isn't it harder to see? Hard to see? It's like, yeah, it's hard to see. Is it harder than you expected? It's like, I guess, I didn't even really know what to expect. I think that's probably really what's going on with with the informal expectations. It's actually like a learning experience. This is what the thing looks like when you don't look at it. But then if you pin a person down, and you do this very methodically, like look here, here's a cue. I'm not giving you any information, but look here, here's a cue in the periphery. Do you think you could see a complex object there? And now they have to think about it and like go over their life's experience, like of having peripheral visual experiences. And the sum of all that is enough to like tell them more or less the right way to respond. Like they have enough information built up about how their own visual systems work that they can answer, that they can make these predictions accurately, even though it's not based on like some kind of like strict, like I said, well-formed knowledge of peripheral vision. But if there were a way to like, get everybody kind of on the same page at the outset, I'd be interested in it.
Thank you.
You're muted now.
Now we are approaching. Oh, okay. Angus, wait. Andrew, are you fine still to go on for a bit?
No, I need to go pretty soon.
Okay. Then Angus, your last question then.
Yeah, let's do one more.
Oh, it's just a couple minor questions, just for clarification. So I just wanted to ask, in your plots where you show the expected performance versus the actual accuracy, your chance level doesn't seem to correspond to either the rank or the suit. It's somewhere in between. So could you just clarify what that chance level is?
It's just the average of the two.
Oh, the average of the two. Okay.
So I think in those plots, I'm just averaging across both conditions.
I see. And then if you look at just one of the conditions by itself, so just suit or rank, do you get the same sort of alignment of the pattern of results?
Yeah, that would be something. If I had more time, then that would be a thing to show, like to confirm to you that the suit and the rank conditions are a little different. I mean, you can see that from the confusion matrices. Rank is harder, but otherwise, like structurally, they're very similar. So everything goes in the same direction with eccentricity and size. You can even collapse these. You can collapse both conditions in interesting ways, and you still get the same pattern. Like with the suit condition, you can collapse it so that basically it's a judgment between black and red. Would I be able to tell if it was a black suit or a red suit? And then the actual accuracy for those two things, it's the same pattern. You can take the face card, you can take the rank and collapse it so that it's like ace, number card, face card. And would I be able to tell if it was an ace or a number card or a face card? And that tracks in the same way with the actual accuracy for those categories. So it's kind of like any way you cut it, you get pretty much the same pattern.
Great. Okay. And then I have two. Yeah, just quickly, I had two other small questions. So you mentioned that you did not tell the participants that they were going to have to identify the cards later on. Yeah. But I might have missed the reason as to why you decided to do that as opposed to just telling them that they would need to do it.
Because there was no reason to tell them. So I just,
okay.
I don't want them thinking about another thing they're going to have to do. That's kind of just standard procedure, I think. If a subject comes in, I have some things I want them to do. Unless they need to know about what they're going to do later, I don't think there's a reason to tell them that. But in this case, I think it's kind of convenient, the fact that they didn't.
All right. Yeah, it was just a minor thing because I would have thought it was the opposite, that you generally want to inform your participants as to everything they're going to do unless there's a reason to hide something. But it's just, I just wanted to check that there wasn't like a specific reason or anything like that.
There's not, I don't think there was a reason, but I think retrospectively, I think it's convenient because it means that there's less reason to suppose that they were like adjusting their expectations for, because they might have thought if I told them, and after this, there's going to be a test of how well you can see the cards. And then they might have got it in their heads, because I know sometimes subjects in psychology experiments are suspicious. I know this from like showing a lot of the studies I did when I was a graduate student were like noise. I would show people white noise or pink noise or like gratings in noise. And some subjects would think, there's something hidden in here. you know, that this is a secret test. Like I'm looking for a face or something, right? Or he's going to spring something on me. And so I think if I told them that after you do this, there's going to be a test of what you can actually see, some people might adjust their performance thinking, there's something to this, you know, something's coming later. And I want to, like, which way do I think it's going to go? He's actually going to make it harder than it really is. And so I'm going to like downgrade my expectations. You know, that's not what I was thinking originally, but I think that it's actually probably kind of true for at least some subject.
Okay, yeah. And then the last question was just, I just wanted to check what you would label as the key results to interpret with relation to the original sort of thought experiment. So is it the actual accuracies versus the expected accuracies, or is it at the very end when you asked them, they said that it was a lot more difficult than they expected? What's the key results to sort of take with regards to that initial Daniel Dennett's sort of card? You can't see the card or identify the card thing. I
think the key result is that correlation, right? The fact that
correlation.
That things fall on that main diagonal. That means that people do know, they know what they can see in the periphery, and they know it in a very detailed way. They know a lot about what they can see.
So yeah, because you said that, I also want to ask, so especially for the high eccentricities and the smaller cards, you do have the confusion matrix where people sort of identify along the diagonal, right? But they still, even though that there's a close alignment with the diagonal, they are still confusing cards like 8 and 9 or 7 and 6 or something like that. And I will just ask, would this be in support, or would this refute Daniel Dennett's sort of question, which is, if you do not see specifically the 6 of hearts, then you have not identified the card, right? Regardless of whether you got it close. So I just want to ask, like, how we should interpret this, in which direction?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I should think about the best way to respond to that kind of thing. But I think that it's a similar situation to any kind of noisy perceptual situation that you put people in, like in a psychophysics task, where you have a stimulus that's near threshold. It has some appearance, but there's something noisy about it. And if I show you the same stimulus over and over and over again, you might make a slightly different judgment every time. So what they see, like for the very small card at 24 degrees eccentricity, they see something. They don't see a lot there. It's very small. It has some detail in it and some color. And based on that, they have some good guesses as to what it probably is. But it certainly doesn't have the appearance of like a clear, well-defined card at the fovea, right? They don't see all the details. They can't. You know, you just don't have the visual equipment to see all those details. But they see enough to like make a reasonable judgment about what it is. And that's all you're ever doing. It's just usually you have a lot more information. Like in the fovea, you have a lot more information to base your judgment on. In the periphery, you have less information. But I think this says that you still have quite a lot of information. It's just not as good as what you have fovea.
Okay, thanks.